Welcome back. Okay, so we're starting the fourth chapter of Nehemiah, and the next couple chapters, um, it's a very interesting narrative that is not interrupted. So hopefully we'll be able to cover a couple chapters in a row right now. So if you have any questions on the verses, please be sure to ask. Just in case, we're going to skip the some of the commentaries so we could get the narrative flow going. It's in especially in the Torah, sometimes the focus is on an individual verse to see all of the laws that we can get out of it. So you go one verse at a time, cover every commentary. And sometimes you have stories, and those stories stretch over the course of multiple chapters. This here is a case here in Nehemiah. Chapters 4 and 5 are really the same story, and chapter 6 is immediately following. So if we could do 4 and 5 today, that would be wonderful. But they're not long chapters. Each one is both are under 20 verses. Okay, starting with verse 4, I'll do the Hebrew. Linda will do English translation. Teresa is ready for commentary. V'hi asher shama Sanballat v'Tovia v'Arvim v'Amonim v'Ashdodim ki also arucha l'chomos Yerushalayim ki chilu haperutzim v'sasim v'yichar lahem ma'od v'yiksharu kulam yachdav lavo l'hilachim b'Yerushalayim v'lasos lo toah v'nis palel el Eloheinu v'namid Mishmar Aleham Yomam Valayla Mipanehem. Okay, please translate the first 3 verses. Linda.
It happened when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashmodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being healed, that the breaches had begun to be sealed, they grew extremely angry. So they all banded together to come and do battle in Jerusalem and to bring ruin upon it. So we prayed to our God and we set up a guard over the workers by day and by night against them.
So, as we said before, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Instead of welcoming the Jews back to the Holy Land, people tried to stop them from reestablishing a Second Temple Commonwealth. We also mentioned previously that King Cyrus had permitted the Jews to build a temple, but did not permit them to shore up their defenses, build the walls of Jerusalem, so it wouldn't look like a uprising. But that didn't help because the natives were restless and they were willing to attack without provocation. So the only thing not building the walls did was expose the Jews to danger. Okay, continuing in the Hebrew, verse 4. Vayomer Yehuda kashal koach v'asa bol ve'afar harbe v'anachnu lo nuchal livnos b'choma. Vayomer tzarenu lo yedu v'lo yiru ad asher navo el tocham v'haragnum v'ishbasnu es hamalacha v'ika asher ba'u haYehudim hayoshvim etzlam v'yomru lanu eser pa'amim mikol hamakomos asher tashuvu alenu. Okay, please translate verses 4 through 6. Linda.
Then the men of Judah said, "The strength of the bear is failing, and the earth is abundant. We are not able to build the wall." And our enemy said, "They will not know of us nor see us before we come among them and kill them, and we halt the work." But then when Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, "From all the places to which you return, they will come against us."
Okay, what does it mean to all places from which you return? Okay, let's go to the commentary there, Teresa. That would be on page 31 in the blue edition of the Art Scroll. From all the places. On verse 6.
Halfway down the second column, Teresa.
And they told us 10 times? No.
From all the places. Next chapter, the next paragraph.
Sorry. From all the places to which you return, they will come against us. For all the places which you turn upon us. Translation refers to Ibn Ezra. They
follows, yeah.
informed the workers that the enemies planned a surprise attack in which they would ambush them at the places to which the workers returned at night. Rashi translates the warning of the impending attack from the Jews who dwelt among the enemies. Take care to gather together from all the scattered sites along the construction area to do battle against our forces. Rabbi offers yet another interpretation, translating, they warned us 10 times of all the places from which they would turn upon us. The Jewish members of the non-Jewish forces revealed the enemy's hiding places from which they intended to launch their attacks. The verb
Tashuvu.
Thank you, in the future, female tense is translated, they would turn, denotes the enemy's constant shifting from one hiding place to another in order to find the most suitable spot from which to launch their ambush. The future tense may sometimes be used to denote repeated action. See Rashi, Job 1:5, Ezekiel 37:7.
So they were threatening to ambush them on the way home after the construction, or on the way back from home to construct. So not really the noble battle in the field of honor. Just sneak attacks, so they could try to whittle down the numbers of people working. Okay. Continuing in the Hebrew, verse 7. Va'amid mi tachtiyos v'makom me'acharei lachoma v'tzechichim va'amid esam l'mishpachos im charvosehem ramchehem v'kash sosehem ve'era va'akum v'omar el ha'chorim vel ha'saganim vel yeser ha'am al tir'u mipnehem es Adonai hagadol v'anora zechuru v'hilachamu al achechem b'nechem uvenosechem neshechem uvatechem. Okay, please translate verses 7 and 8.
I set up defenders beneath the site, behind the wall, on the cliffs. I set up the people by families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. When I saw, I got up and said to the aristocrats and to the nobles and to the rest of the people, do not fear them. Remember the great and awesome Lord, and fight for your brothers, your sons and daughters, your wives and your homes.
Yeah. On verse 8, the paragraph, do not fear them. Could you read that, Teresa?
Do not fear them. This parallels the biblically commanded speech recited by the Cohen anointed for war. Before the Jewish warriors entered into battle, let your heart not be faint, do not be afraid. Deuteronomy 23. See Rambam Melachim 7.
Mhm.
For
Okay. Over your brothers. Yeah.
for your brothers, for the sake of your brothers, Rashi.
Okay. Let's continue in the Hebrew. Verse 9. Vayika asher shamu oyevenu kino da lanu vayafer ha'elohim es atzasam v'nashav kulanu el hachoma ish el malachto vahi min hayom hahu chatzin orai osim b'malacha v'chatz yam machazikim v'ramachim hamaginim v'kashasos v'ashir yonim v'asarim acharei kol beis Yehuda. Okay, please translate verses 9 and 10.
It happened when our enemies heard that it had become known to us that God annulled their scheme. We all then returned to the wall, each man to his work. It happened from that day onward that half of my youths did the work, and half of them held the spears, the shields, and the bows, and the armor, and the officers backed the entire house of Judah.
So when they heard that their sneak attack was spoiled, so they regrouped and planned to attack again. So what Nehemiah ordered was that everyone should have their weapons displayed at all times, so it looks like there's no weak spot for anyone who is secretly spying on them. Okay, continuing in the Hebrew in verse 11. Habonim b'choma, v'nosim b'sevel, Omsim ba'achas yado oseh b'malacha va'achas machazekes hashalach. Vabonim ish charbo asurim al masnav uvonim v'tokea b'shofar etzli. V'omar el achorim vel suganim vel yeser ha'am hamalacha harbe urachava v'anachnu nifradim al hachoma Rechokim ish me'achiv. Okay, please translate verses 11, 12, and 13.
Those who built the wall and those who lifted and carried the burdens would do their work with one hand, while one hand held a weapon. As for the builders, each man's sword was girded at his side as they built. The one who sounded the shofar was next to me. I said to the aristocrats and to the nobles and to the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are dispersed along the wall, distant from one another.
So Nehemiah stood prominently with a tokea, a person who knows how to blow a shofar. So when the spies were to see him standing with that, they knew that at any moment they could sound the alarm. So they can't just pick off one side of the wall at a time. Everyone would know that there was an attack if there was an attack on any side of the wall. In the Hebrew, continuing in verse 14, B'makom asher tishma'u es kol hashofar shama tikavtzu elenu Eloheinu yilachem lenu v'anachnu osim b'malacha v'chetz yam machazikim b'ramachim me'alos hashachar ad tzeis hakochavim gam ba'is hahi marti la'am ha'ish v'na'ro yalinu b'soch Yerushalayim Vayu lanu halayla mishmar v'hayom malacha. Vein ani v'achai unarai v'anshe hamishmar asher acharai ein anachnu poshtim b'gadenu ish shilcho hamoyim. Okay, please translate verses 14 through 17 through the end of the chapter.
To the place Where you hear the sound of the shofar, there you are to gather yourselves to us. Our God will fight for us. So we did the work, with half of them grasping the spears, from the rising of the dawn until the emergence of the stars. Also at that time I said to the people, let each man and his attendant spend the night in Jerusalem. Thus the night was a watch for us, and the day was for work. Thus neither I nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the watch who were under me, none of us removed our garments. No one disrobed, even to launder in water.
So it was a very difficult, like it was like you can imagine people in a trench in the middle of a war. That's the conditions that they had to rebuild Jerusalem. Even though they had the decree of the king to go ahead and build it, uh, the 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 slander that had been done by the sons of Haman, uh, that with a false report that the Jews would rebel if they could have the walls, that led to all of this trouble. And this was something that occurred for weeks and weeks. Remember, construction in those days wasn't an overnight process. Continuing in chapter 5. And again, we could ask questions later on, even of the previous chapter, but let's continue the narrative so we don't lose context. Okay, please translate verse 1, chapter 5.
Now the outcry of the people and their wives concerning their Jewish brethren was great.
ויש אשר אומרים בנינו ובנותינו אנחנו רבים וניקחה דגן ונאכלה ונחיה. ויש אשר אומרים שדותינו וכרמנו ובתינו אנחנו עורבים וניקחה דגן ברב. ויש אשר אומרים להבינו כסף למידס המלך סודותינו וכרמנו. ואתה כבשר אחינו בשרנו כבניהם בנינו, והנה אנחנו חובשים את בנינו ואת בנותינו לעבדים. ויש מבנותינו נכבשוס ואין לאל ידינו, ושדותינו וכרמנו לאחרים. Okay, please translate verses 2 through 5. Linda.
There were those who said, with our sons and our daughters, we are numerous, and we must buy grain that we may eat and remain alive. And there were those who said, we are mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our homes to buy grain during the famine. And there were those who said, we have borrowed money against our fields and our vineyards for the king's tax. Now our flesh is as worthy as the flesh of our brethren, and our sons are as worthy as their sons. Yet we must press our sons and our daughters into being servants. Some of our daughters have been pressed into servitude, and our hands do not have the means to redeem them, and our fields and our vineyards are held by others.
So, besides the fact that the temple was at risk of being attacked, there was also great poverty among the people. They were trying to avoid the effects of famine by buying food, and the king was taxing them but not giving them grain. And then finally, some of the people who were starving sold some of their daughters into servitude to become handmaids, so the girls wouldn't starve, and the family would be able to use the proceeds to make sure they wouldn't starve either. The problem was, who are they selling their daughters to, right? If the Jews were impoverished, that means I believe I saw a commentary They were selling their daughters away to Gentile nations in an era before a universal monotheism. So, I mean, religiously speaking, that was a big nightmare. Okay, let's continue in the Hebrew, verse 6. Vichali ma'od kasher shamati es za kasam veis hadvarim ha'ela v'yimalech libi alai v'ariva es hachorim v'saganim v'omera lahem masha ish b'achiv atem nosim noshim v'atein alehem kihila gedola v'omera lahem אנחנו קנינו es אחינו היהודים הנמכרים לגויים כדי בנו וגם אתם נמכרו es אחיכם ונמכרו לנו ויחרישו ולא מצאו דבר. Okay, please translate verses 6 through 8.
I became very angry when I heard their outcry in these matters. Then my heart moved me, and I confronted the aristocrats and the nobles and said to them, "Are you creditors of loans against your brothers?" And I gathered a large crowd around them. I said to them, "We have ransomed our brother Jews who were sold to non Jews for as much as we could afford. Now, will you sell your brothers again only to be resold to us?" They were silent. They could not find a response.
Okay, let's let's look at the commentary here in verse 8. The let's see, maybe it's the fourth paragraph. Now you will sell your brothers again. Could you read that?
Okay. Now you
Verse-
would sell your brothers again, only to be resold to us. Nehemiah showed the rich Jews the absurdity of the situation. You who now own Jewish slaves, whom you have taken from your fellow Jews, will sell them to the non-Jews when your own wealth begins to wane. Then, as in the past, the Jewish community to which you belong will redeem them. Thus, you yourself will eventually pay the non Jews for the very slaves you sold to them. Rashi. Rit Metraning translates, "Now you too will sell your brothers, then they will be sold to us. We are forced to redeem the slaves from your hands, just as we were forced to redeem them from the non-Jews." According to Mitzadotes, Nehemiah spoke sarcastically, saying, Sell your brothers to be sold to us. It is not befitting to redeem a slave from the hands of your own brother. Better sell your slaves to the non-Jews so that you may redeem them from their hands. They were
So their slaves were not yet Jewish. So if they sold them to non-Jews, there wouldn't be as great of a spiritual crisis. But selling Jews who had to keep 613 mitzvahs to non-Jews was a spiritual nightmare. And previously in verse 7, let's see the third paragraph in verse 7. Could you read that, Teresa? Are you creditors?
Are you creditors of loans against your brothers? Why are you moneylenders? You should support your brothers with charity rather than lend them money and then confiscate their children and their property. Rashi Metzados.
So just a little charity, and there wouldn't be this whole crisis. And they were silent from embarrassment. Rashi says, including verse 8. Okay, continuing the Hebrew on verse 9. V'omar lo tov hadavar asher atem osim halo biras Elohinu tilechu me cherpas hagoyim oyevenu v'gam ani achai v'un'arai noshim bahem kesef v'dagan nazva na esamasha hazeh. Hashivu na lahem kayom hazeh, kahayom hazeh. Sirosehem karmehem zeisehem uvatehem um'as hakesef v'adagan hatirosh v'hayitzor asher tem noshim bahem. Okay, please translate verses 9, 10, and 11.
Then I said, "The thing you are doing is not good. Surely you should walk with the fear of our God because of the scorn of the nations, our enemies. I and my brethren and my servants as well have lent them money and grain. Let us all now relinquish this debt. Return to them now this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their homes, as well as the hundreds in money, and the grain, the wine, and the oil that you hold against them."
Okay, continuing in verse 12. Vayamaru nashivu mehem lo nevakesh ken naaseh kasher ata omer v'ekra es hakohanim v'ashpi'em lasos kadavar hazeh gam chatzni na'arti v'omra kacha yena'er ha'elohim es kol ha'ish asher lo yakim es hadavar hazeh mi beso umigio v'chacha yihya na'ur v'reik v'imru kol ha'kahal Amen v'yahalalu es Adonai v'yas ha'am kadavar hazeh. Gam. Okay, let's translate through here. Okay, verses 12, 13, and 12 and 13. Please translate.
They replied, "We shall return it all, and we will make no demands of them. We shall do as you say." Then I summoned the Kohanim, and I administered an oath upon them to act in accordance with this matter. I also shook the hem of my garment and said, "So may God shake out from his home and from his toil any man who does not fulfill this matter, and so may he remain shaken out and empty." The entire congregation said, "Amen," and they praised Hashem, and the people acted in accordance with this matter.
Okay, so now, this concludes this narrative starting from the start of chapter 4, where they were being threatened from ambush, even just to go home to their villages from working. They were threatened while they're working, and as they were doing this, the rich nobles who were keeping the villages safe was allowing the sale of little girls instead of just giving charity. So that explains why Nehemiah became angry. And Nehemiah was extremely righteous, obviously, one of the few people whose book became part of the Tanakh. But in this next section of chapter 5, Nehemiah is going to make a big mistake. It's one of those cases where it's a mistake for a righteous person of his level. A regular person, people may not even notice it was a mistake. But we see that Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, he had a, he passed away before entering the Holy Land because he made a mistake at his level. Most people who make a mistake and like he made, it wouldn't be considered such a big sin. For Moses, it was a big sin, so therefore he had a big penalty. So too, Nehemiah has a something that maybe we wouldn't even notice as a sin, but in the context of how he said it and what he was referring to, it was a big sin, and he's punished. But to understand it, we're going to have to look at the commentary, and which quotes the Talmud and Talmudic sources, the Midrashim. And it's very profound because, again, Nehemiah was one of the most famous potential Mashiachs, messianic characters in world history. So the way he is judged is very important for us to understand. Because again, if the very righteous can't get away with the sin, certainly the not very righteous are not getting away with the bad stuff. But of course, the very righteous are judged at a different level. Since they're not likely to sin, they have to be careful more so than a regular person. So now let's adjust our minds to focus on exactly what is occurring here, and exactly what is the traditions from the Talmud on this as well. Okay, starting in verse 14, chapter 5, and the chapter again ends in verse 19. So I'm going to read chapter 4, verse 14 through 19, all in one reading, and then we'll just focus on the commentary more. Okay? So in the blue edition, the Milesian style art scroll, this would be on page 42, 43 in Nehemiah. גם מיום אשר ציווה אותי להיות פחם בארץ יהודה, משנת 20 ועד שנת 32, לארתחשסת המלך שנים 12, אני ואחי לחם הפחה לא אכלתי, והפחוס הראשונים אשר לפני הכבידו על העם, ויקחו מהם בלחם ויין אחר כסף שקלים 40, גם נעריהם שלטו על העם, ואני לא עשיתי כן מפני יראת אלוהים. וגם במלאכת החומה הזאת החזקתי בשדה לא קנינו, וכל נערי קבוצים שם על המלאכה, והיהודים והסגנים 150 איש, והבאים אלינו מן הגויים, אשר סביבנו על שולחני, ואשר היה נעשה ליום אחד, שור אחד, צאן 6 ברורוס וציפורים נעשו לי, ובין 10 ימים, בכל יין להרבה, ועם זה לחם הפכה, לא ביקשתי כי כבדה העבודה על העם הזה. זכר לי אלוהי לטובה כל אשר עשיתי על העם הזה. Okay, please translate verses 14 through 19 to conclude chapter 5, and then we'll discuss more of the commentary.
Moreover, from the day that the king appointed me as governor of the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Ascataris, I hate that name.
Artaxerxes.
Thank you. 12 years, I and my brethren did not eat of the governor's food. The former governors who were before me had imposed burdens upon the people and taken bread and wine from them, in addition to 40 silver shekels, and also their servants domineered over the people. But I did not do so because of my fear of God. Also, I supported the work of this wall, so we did not buy any field, and all of my servants were gathered there for work. Ordinary Jews and nobles, 150 men, in addition to those proselytes who came to us from the nations around us, were at my table. That which was prepared for each day was 1 bull, 6 selected sheep, and fowl prepared for me, and every 10 days a multitude of all sorts of wine. Yet, despite this, I did not request the governor's food, for the labor weighed heavily upon upon this people. Remember in my favor, O my God, all that I did for this people.
Okay. So let's analyze this closer, and then I want to explain the problem that occurred here outside, and then we'll go into the commentary here in the book as well. Okay, so first of all, we have very important facts. Verse 14 teaches us how long was Nehemiah a governor, and here 12 years. So he was a governor for 12 years, and all that time he did not eat of the governor's food. So he didn't try to get favors, and he wanted to be extra careful with kosher. And also, commentary will, addresses that he didn't want the governor to increase the tax on the people so that Nehemiah could have a fancier meal, even if it was kosher. So that's very noble of him. Now, verse 15 is very profound. It teaches. Remember, we had a controversy in the commentaries. There's multiple Mimre Chazal saying of the sages about who is the identity of Sheish Batzar in Ezra chapter 1, of Zerubbabel, and of Nehemiah. So about Nehemiah, there'll be more discussion about his identity later on in the commentary in later chapters. So, but let's focus again on Sheish Batzar and Zerubbabel. So Sheish Batzar, we learned either it was Daniel or Zerubbabel. And I concluded, and I showed you sources at the time, it had to be Daniel. And then by Zerubbabel, either Zerubbabel was a separate person. I mean, he is mentioned in Haggai and Zechariah, you know. So Zerubbabel is the name of someone. The question is, was he Zerubbabel was always called Zerubbabel, or did he later change his name to Nehemiah? So there's one opinion that he changed his name to Nehemiah, and I believe a one of the classic commentaries quotes that. I think, let's see. Also, I saw it most recently. I think Rabbi Schwab holds by that Nehemiah and Zerubbabel was one. However, from the preponderance of midrashim that we quoted previously, it seems that Daniel, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel were three different people, and Nehemiah was in fact a governor from Judah, a messianic figure, potential Mashiach of his generation. It was not according to those who say maybe he was a Kohen priest like Ezra. So okay, so we have three potential Mashiachs in a row as the three governors um, in books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Sheish Batzar, which is the name given to Daniel when he survived 6 different troubles. So then Daniel was the governor for the first year of the Second Temple period. And then the governor for the next 19 years was Zerubbabel. And then the governor for the next 12 years was Nehemiah. Another complication for those who want to say Nehemiah and Zerubbabel was the same one. So then you'd have to come up with a name of another governor in between them, because according to one exegesis on that, Nehemiah had to leave the country, go back to Babylon, and then come back again for the book of Nehemiah, if he was Zerubbabel. So it's really hard to fit that. So just from my perspective, we have to say Sheish Batzar was Daniel, who was there for 1 year. Then he went back to Shushan, and then was Zerubbabel for 19 years, and then was Nehemiah for 12 years. So we see in verse 14, Nehemiah for 12 years listed here explicitly. And then in 15, Nehemiah says something that you would have to say the previous governors were extremely righteous for this to be a sin, right? If he was talking about the previous governors of Judea while Israel was in exile, the Babylonian surrogates. So what would that really be telling us? Because where were most of the Jewish people? They were not as under the taxation of the former governors. So therefore, we have to say when he's saying former governors, he's referring to the two Jewish governors mentioned, Sheshbatzar and Zerubbabel. Okay, so this lends support to the theory that I'm embracing. This verse is in support that Sheshbatzar was Daniel, the first governor. Zerubbabel was the second governor. Two separate people from Nehemiah, the third governor. The minimum plural in Hebrew is the number two. So when we say former governors, he's talking about two governors. And the only two governors that were over the Jews was Sheshbatzar and Zerubbabel. Okay. So that means, and we're going according to the opinion, Sheshbatzar, well, therefore the Sheshbatzar being Daniel, right? Because he's not Zerubbabel. And the only other person mentioned as Sheshbatzar would be Daniel. So that now the complication here, he is insulting the prophet of God, Daniel, and Zerubbabel, who according to Metzudas David is the forefather of Mashiach, the actual Mashiach. So therefore, Nehemiah here is criticizing and boasting his honor above the great Daniel, who is greater in prophecy than Haggai and Zechariah, right? Is considered a greater prophet. And he was also increasing himself above Zerubbabel. Now, according to those who say Nehemiah is Zerubbabel, there's no need to mention this. But again, where do you come with two other governors from the simple meaning of the text? Zerubbabel had to be somebody different from Daniel, and he had to be someone different from Nehemiah for this verse to even work. Because why would Nehemiah even complain about a governor when the Jews were in exile? They weren't there to suffer. So therefore, he has to be kind of saying, God, be nice to me because I was better than the two Jewish governors before me, right? The problem is the two Jewish governors before him were on a higher spiritual level than Nehemiah. In this one area, Nehemiah did something better than them. But how does he boast himself above God's beloved? That's the first mistake in this reading in this. But interesting enough, his punishment is not written on verse 15, where he says, "I didn't do what they did because of my fear of God," implying that he had more fear of God than Daniel and Zerubbabel. That sounds like a kind of not humble, right? That would be the sin I would have thought. But actually, the last verse of this chapter is what the sages quote. Remember in my favor, O God, all that I did for this people. So now, how is that the sin? So now let's go into the commentary, look at that, and then try to understand why is remember me favorably for the good I did. Why is that a bigger sin than saying, I had fear of God and those prophets didn't have fear of God, so to speak. He didn't actually put it in that negative light, right? But it's like, I mean, I would have thought, okay, that he wasn't being humble and a potential Mashiach has to be humble, right? I would have thought that was the big error. But according to the sages, remember me in my favor, O God, all they did for this people. That was the big error. Wow. So we're going to have to look at a quotation of the Gemara. All right. So here in the Art Scroll, in the blue edition, so this will be on verse 15. Teresa, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, please read the commentary on verse 15.
Starting at the beginning.
Yeah, the first two paragraphs at least.
Okay. The former governors. This includes Daniel, who was governor over the Jews before Nehemiah. Sanhedrin 93b. See Art Scroll Ezra 5:15.
Okay, so our scroll here is holding that Daniel was the governor, all right? So which means he was Sheish Betzar. Interesting here, right? Because here our scroll is holding Sheish Betzar. It sounded like our scroll was giving alternate theories before, but here definitely it sounds like they're saying Daniel is Sheish Betzar, correct?
Yeah.
That's my understanding. Okay, please continue. Had imposed.
Had imposed burdens upon the people. They placed the weight of the taxes upon the people, Rashi.
Okay, now just to mention, um, so if this is only a libertarian argument by Nehemiah, I saved the people's money, right? But because they were taxing the people too much. However, in a situation where there's no support, the government is letting people do stuff, but they're not actively helping them so much, and there's people trying to kill them. Taxing the people so we could afford a standing army, etc., is not wrong, right? So, in other words, the criticism by in verse 15 was kind of libertarianism by Nehemiah, not actual righteousness. You understand? Um, it's beautiful to save people's money. So the theoretically libertarianism is beautiful, right? That you don't take away people's money if you don't have to. That's a good idea. But the way it's applied here, what choice did Daniel and Zerubbabel have but to tax the people when they were getting no help from the outside? Remember, Nehemiah was going in the days of Darius when Esther and Mordecai was advising Darius to send more financial help to the Jews in Israel. You see? So Nehemiah had more money to work with. So how could he even judge them from there? But but that's not the reason. Again, verse 19 that he says, "Remember the good I did." So what does this mean? Okay, let's continue the paragraph of the Talmud.
The Talmud, Sanhedrin 93b, asserts that although
Nehemiah,
Nehemiah
right?
was the author of the book describing his activities, it is nevertheless entitled the Book of Ezra. See commentaries 2:1:1. Nehemiah's name was deleted from the title of his book as a punishment for his criticism of the former governors, particularly Daniel, who was greater than he. Another opinion attributes the deletion of Nehemiah's name to his request for God's recognition of his good deeds. Verse 19.
Okay, so there's opinions that both verse 15 and 19 were the cause of Nehemiah's sin. What was his punishment? We find in the Talmud, right? So that was written down. That discussion was written down a few hundred years after the events of this book. So everyone was calling the book of Nehemiah. It was only called the book of Ezra in those days. Nobody called it the book of Nehemiah. Later
Because of
on,
his criticism of Daniel.
right. So it's debate. According to one, it's saying because he was implying that the holy prophet Daniel and the forefather of Mashiach Zerubbabel didn't have his level of fear of God. He implied it. Maybe he only meant it in this area. Maybe Nehemiah himself meant in this area I showed more fear of God. But still, we're talking about one of the great prophets of history. We're talking about the forefather of Mashiach and Zerubbabel, and seems to be easy for him to criticize. He could have just said, um, you know, again, if he said that, uh, he could have said like, I was fearful to burden the people. Why, using the phrase his fear of God. So now it's like combating Daniel and Zerubbabel on their area of strength, right? You see what I'm saying? But again, logistically, I don't know how that works because Nehemiah was sent with more money than Daniel and Zerubbabel had. So I don't know how he was ascribing a great act to him. Maybe Daniel and Zerubbabel would do exactly the same thing if they had as much money as he had collected. You understand? So I don't understand what Nehemiah's position was. According to one reading in the Talmud, that was the sin. According to others, it was the verse, remember in my favor, O God, all that I did for this people. So now how is that a sin? So um so all I did for the people. So before in according to the one who says verse 15 was okay, it's verse 19 that's a sin, right? So saying I did that because of my fear of God, I wanted to be extra strict before God, right? So it's just my personal humor, my personal stricture. I wanted to show God I feared him, so therefore I did this. This is between him and God. So it was uh his personal piety, right? So having an extra personal piety is not bad. And if you're blessed to have be more pious in one area that greater than a prophet of God, that's not such a bad thing, right? But if you're going according to philosophy that you were kind to the people by having less taxes because of fear of heaven, so then how could you say all that I did for this people if you're claiming fear of heaven, right? And you're doing this as a personal stricture between you and God, a personal relationship between you and God. You're doing kindness because that's what God would do himself if he was a human. So how could you say all that I did for this people? According to your own philosophy, it was between you and God. You were just trying to emulate God. God is the one who saved the people, right? So in other words, he's undoing the benefit of what he just said in verse 15. I did it for fear of God. Well, how could you say you did it for fear of God? You all you did for the people. You did it for the people. You didn't do it for fear of God. You just contradicted yourself. Now, if it's for the people, you didn't do it for fear of God, right? So now, verse 19 is saying for fear of God was almost a boast because now you're saying you feared God, but what about Daniel and Zerubbabel? Didn't they fear God? You see what I'm saying? So he should have either said verse 15 that he did it for fear of God, or he could have said it he did it for the people. But by claiming he did the exact same thing for fear of God and for the people, he's implying that Daniel and Zerubbabel didn't do it for were lacking. You know what I'm saying? It's an indirect insult. So now, if he had only said it about Daniel, so now if we're judging it based on Daniel, so Daniel had a book in Tanakh named after him, so did Nehemiah. But Daniel was greater than Nehemiah, so therefore Nehemiah also had to not have the book named after him anymore, so that he wouldn't be considered equal to Daniel, who he just tried to place below him in this area. Um, and again, there's room to say that Nehemiah didn't intend to put down Nehemiah and Zerubbabel as people less than him. Just in this one area, he was trying to do good, and he felt that he did better than Nehemiah and than Zerubbabel and Daniel. Now, and the problem with him speaking against Zerubbabel is that Zerubbabel he's mentioned in multiple books of Tanakh, but he doesn't have a book named after him, right? So if he is trying to lower Zerubbabel and Zerubbabel doesn't have a book named after him, how could Nehemiah have a book named after him? You understand? So this is what is established that for almost 1,000 years, the book of Nehemiah was just considered a longer part of the book of Ezra, and later on it became separated again. There was a commentary I read about how the sin of Nehemiah was eventually forgiven. So over the course of many years, and this is related to the concept I taught before about kapar ladoros, where God spreads out the punishment of a very righteous person by kind of doing something a little bit uh, like lowering their honor a bit. For example, the sin of Reuben, the son of Jacob, is a classic example where he didn't actually commit adultery, but the verse sounded like he did, but he didn't actually commit adultery. The problem was that he messed up the bed of prophecy of Jacob, and interrupting the bed where the prophet has prophecy, is the worst kind of sin possible. So what's the worst insult that could be given to somebody in his father's house, that he um, was inappropriate with the concubine. So that was a kapar ladoros. The tribe of Reuben would have suffered if Reuben did not have a punishment, right? So Reuben did repentance for having defiled his father's honor, but the sin of interrupting prophecy was so great that it could have led to punishment of the tribe of Reuben for generation after generation. Therefore, Reuben himself had to endure a mistaken impression about him for people who don't know the Talmudic explanation. But thankfully, we know the Talmudic explanation, so we know Reuben was innocent. But at first glance, Reuben was made to look guilty as a kapara, and I call that kapara ladoros. Similarly, Nehemiah had a kapara ladoros where he lost his name on his own book for hundreds of years, perhaps 1,000 years, and then at some point, eventually, the book started to be called Nehemiah again. So fascinating, but it just goes to show you. I mean, you could, even if you did a mitzvah greater than one of the great people in history, there's no room for conceit, and there's no room to try to boost your ego at their expense, right? But here, philosophically, Nehemiah had to choose a side. He either had to be doing this for fear of God, like how could I charge the poor people tax, right? God will be angry with me if I do that. Or he had to do it for the people. Okay, so again, now if just logically thinking about this, if Nehemiah had more money, right, than uh, than uh, than Daniel and Zerubbabel, and there were people, impoverished people in here mentioned in chapter 5, how much more it would have been worse in the time of Daniel, right, and Zerubbabel. So this explains it why Nehemiah felt it was so hard on the people, right? Nehemiah saw there were rich nobles, and still he refused taxes because he was afraid it would trickle down and hurt the poor. So if it was worse in the time of Daniel and Zerubbabel, so how could they possibly charge taxes? Apparently that's my guess. That was his reasoning. So but it was an extreme judgment because again, Nehemiah saw it was a matter of life and death, even in his generation, where he was permitted to build the wall. How much more so it must have been dangerous in the time of Daniel and Zerubbabel. So therefore, if they had to collect the tax to make sure there was enough weapons, right? Now remember, in the book of Samuel, there was one time when only two swords could be found in all of the land of Israel, because the Philistines had confiscated all the weapons. So it wasn't always easy to afford weapons. So just something like that, of course, there had to be some sort of taxation. It's just part and parcel of the situation. You can't really blame the previous governors. Now, if Nehemiah was a better at finances, and he was able to provide a benefit to the people, that was a gift of God to the people. It was Nehemiah should not have taken credit for it. But it's like Nehemiah is saying God should show him extra mercy because he was more thoughtful of the people than the greater people before him. Okay, so let's look at the verse on verse 19 and the commentary there. This would be on page 44. Okay, Teresa, can you read the commentary,
Okay.
verse 19? Remember?
Remember in
Mhm.
my favor, O my God, consider my actions as a source of merit for me, Metzedos. One opinion in Sanhedrin 93b asserts that Nehemiah was punished for this request by the deletion of his name as the author of his book. See commentary to verse 15. Although King David had a similar request in Psalms 106:4, remember me, Hashem, when you show your people favor. David's request was acceptable since he called on God to exercise mercy in remembering his good deeds. Nehemiah, however, erred in thinking that his good deeds is in themselves made him deserving of merit, even without God's compassion. No man may justifiably make this assumption, and for this Nehemiah was punished. See Maharsha,
Mhm.
Sanhedrin 93b. Enof Yosef in Ein Yaakov explains that David addressed God using the four letter name, which denotes mercy. Nehemiah, however, invoked the same uh,
The name Elokai.
Elokai, yes, a reference to God as the dispenser of justice. Enough Yosef further explains that David was deserving of merit even by the exacting standards of divine judgment. Nevertheless, he based his entreaty on the mercy of God, as if he himself had not earned merit, recognizing that no man becomes righteous without God's help. Nehemiah too earned this exalted station according to the righteousness inherited in his life. His entreaty in which he neglected to call upon God's mercy reflected this and was found wanting. For this shortcoming, he was punished.
So he assumed he had done such a righteous act that even God, in a moment of justice and judgment of justice, would still have to be compelled by justice to show him mercy. It's best to be humble and not toot one's horn, and appeal to God's mercy, even if somebody acquired it. And we learned that from David. David deserved mercy while God was in his state of judgment. And so Nehemiah was appealing as if he was like his forefather David. But David asked for mercy. Nehemiah didn't even ask for mercy, and that's what he didn't get. You know, in this regard. Okay, please continue. Al Ha'am Hazeh, for literally upon this people.
for it upon his people. Remember all that I did for the good of this people. Metzodos. Malbon presents an alternative explanation. Remember in my favor all that I did upon this people. Let my good deeds be accredited, not to me, but to the entire people. And let the favor I enjoy because of my good deeds be visited upon this people. Nehemiah's request is based on the principle that the merits of the saintly protect the entire Jewish people. This is still consistent with the Talmud's statement that Nehemiah was punished for asking God to credit him. See preceding comments. Nehemiah thought he was deserving of credit and asked that his credit be transferred to the people. This was an improper assumption since no man can presume to be deserving of credit, but may gain favor only through God's mercy.
Okay, for example, if if you have a a tall metal beam, right? If you try to press down on it, a tall metal beam could hold up a building. But if you were to turn it sideways, right? It, and then you put weight in the middle of it, so a much lesser weight can bend the metal beam. So something has weak spots, pressure points, and it has parts where it's stronger, right? So too, anytime someone does a good deed, you never know, was it only because, for example, if they overcame uh, a long distance, was it because uh, they deserve to have a injury to their leg, and God held off that punishment until after they finished the mitzvah? So, in other words, God's mercy enabled the mitzvah to even occur. Or if someone was traveling a long way and they were destined to have a horrible accident along the way, and God pushed aside the accident so they could finish the mitzvah. How are they taking credit for all their efforts to do the mitzvah? There was no mitzvah destined. It's only because God bailed them out and gave them a safe trip when they didn't deserve one that there was even a mitzvah. So at many points along the way of doing a complex mitzvah, there's many areas where they could have, for one reason or another, not been allowed to complete the mitzvah. So therefore, it's easier to credit God and his mercy that a person did a mitzvah than it is to credit a person who did the mitzvah. If not for others, right, who are outside of the situation, at least that person themselves. This should be the attitude that at so many points along the way, if God had removed his mercy, there would have been no mitzvah possibility whatsoever. Right? So how could he call down a judgment? So therefore, when it says in verse 19, remember in my favor, oh my God, all that I did for this people, it's because he said Elokai instead of Hashem, because he said even by justice remember me, and that's too risky. But the commentary said that if King David had said that, it would have still been worked because King David was so righteous. But Nehemiah couldn't get away with it, and he had 1,000 years punishment for it. He drew judgment upon himself, and he was lacking. So apparently, there were several steps along the way where Nehemiah could have been overwhelmed, but God's mercy was constantly protecting him. Right, so we have to assume that God's mercy was constantly active, and God was fulfilling his word to restore the people to the land. He swore to Jeremiah. So, therefore, since God's fulfilling his word, a person can't take credit for it. Like God said to the children of Israel, not for your merit do I do this, right? But to fulfill the word I spoke to your forefathers, and because of the wickedness of the nations that you come to inherit. That's what so that's why he's driving them from before them.
He was kind of letting his ego get the best of him, wasn't he?
I'm sorry, could you get closer to the speaker?
I said he was letting his ego get the best of him in a sense.
Right. Well, in a sense, I mean, first of all, if you know the previous two governors are Daniel and Zerubbabel, the forefather of Mashiach, maybe it's a good idea not to compare yourselves to for judgment. But
Mhm.
the idea is that even again, if he was appealing to God, I did kindness to the people, do kindness also to me. So that's Mida Keneged Mida. If you're talking like from a judgment perspective, he could say, um, I did it for mercy on the people. Please show me mercy. Right? That would have worked, right? Logically speaking. What he did was he said, I had more fear of heaven than the people before me. You know, please remember me for good. And then, but he was appealing to God's justice. I mean, really, what does it mean? Remember for good? There's so many people in the world. Why should any one individual be remembered more than the others? How are we not equal before Hashem? So
Mhm.
if we're not equal before Hashem, and for whatever reason a person needs that ego boost, let's say Sanballat's evil words against him had depressed him or something, and he needed to get out of it. Okay, so he could ask for God just to, heal the low self-esteem that he's suffering from. You know, in his state of low self-esteem, he shouldn't try to um, decree, demand a decree of righteousness based on a system of justice that he wasn't able to uh, withstand. You understand? He had to. He needed mercy, but he appealed for justice. So it's unusual that a person basically requesting that he should have something more than others, right? That's, in other words, being rewarded more than others is generally like requesting a favor, right? But he acted like he was entitled. Complicating it was he was juxtaposing how he was greater apparently than, or at least in this area, than Daniel or Zerubbabel, forefather Mashiach. So very complicated. But the fact is, he did a bigger mitzvah than Daniel or Zerubbabel, but that's because God enabled it, right? So in other words, God was trying to upgrade the kindness he was doing to the Jewish people. He did it through Nehemiah, and then for whatever reason, Nehemiah wanted to get special remembrance of him for this. I'm guessing it's because there was more harsh accusation of him, and I'm thinking like it's the harsh words of his critics I was getting to him, and made him make this mistake. That would be my guess. Um, so like remember the problem that Daniel and Zerubbabel faced was that they were told to build the temple, and then they were told don't build the temple. So they didn't have an imperative to force a behavior that would bring out the ire of the nations. They could focus on just having a uh, a settlement of Jews in the Holy Land without worrying so much about they're building up the temple, or they're building up a wall. So now there would be a pushback by nations that didn't want Israel to be successful. Israel was already stopped from being successful by Ahasuerus, not allowing the temple to be rebuilt. So therefore, there just wasn't the same kind of abuse being perpetrated on Daniel or Zerubbabel as was on Nehemiah. So it was, in other words, there was no precedent in history at that point that Jewish leaders should be insulted so much and under so much pressure like Nehemiah was. So if that's his worst sin, thank God. So after however many years it was that Nehemiah was called the second half of the book of Ezra. So eventually he was forgiven, and now, thank God, we could see his righteousness. But it's really amazing. God gave him the opportunity, and he pursued it, and he was blessed to actually do at least one mitzvah we know about, greater than both Daniel or Zerubbabel. And I mean, that's amazing. So yeah, Nehemiah is really cool, but this explicitly brings out that it was out of the Chesed Hashem that it occurred, not because of his righteousness. So not like King David. King David ascribed always to God's mercy. God's mercy did it, even when King David was worthy that it could go in his merit. Whereas Nehemiah did the opposite for whatever reason. And apparently, I think it's because the historic emotional baggage he had to deal with as in his generation. Any questions? Any questions? If you want to ask a question, please unmute your mic.
No? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Good class.
We appreciate it very much, Rabbi.
Was
All right, thank you.
excellent. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much for learning with me, and looking forward to next time.